You want to say what? So I'm just trying to we talked about this week. Yeah. Yes. It's not Jennifer. Yes.
She saw for her daily adventure.
Okay, what's she gonna do today?
Going to go to the library.
Yeah.
My first time in church.
You go, sir.
Oh, we got to get volunteers, huh?
Yeah. But we have a slide for that.
Oh, okay. Okay. Is this on? No, it is. Good morning. Shall we get, we've got a post there. There's people hiding behind the post. That's okay. They're not really paying attention to me. So I'm Dick Hart. We have Jan Scheffer. We're chairs of SEC events. First slide, of course, is Note Well. If everyone wants to read over that. So we'll start off some administration. We need a minute taker and volunteers for a minute taker.
Yeah, so this is where we stop until we get a minute taker. We actually do need one. Even if it's your first time in the working group, people are supposed to say their name. Could you take minutes for us? Thank you very much. And we need a Jabber scribe to channel people from the Jabber room.
Okay.
Thank you.
And the blue sheets are going around. Everybody, there's a blue sheet moving around. Where is it now?
I've got it.
Thanks, Tony. Are you going to let other people have it too?
No.
So our focus, we still have we have a single working group draft. We have a couple of IDs that we will have presentations on and that are at a higher level. And we've got some use case discussions going on. And Yaron drew this pretty picture, which, do you want to talk about your picture?
Yeah, maybe I should. Okay. So for people who are new to this working group, and actually also for people who are not new, it can be confusing. Over time, we have a zoo of internet drafts. So this tries to put the stuff in order. At the bottom, we have the working group document, the set format, which is related to the JOT best common practices that we're working on in parallel. On top of that, we have a single set delivery over HTTP draft that will be presented today. And then we have two ways to manage those HTTP streams. One is with REST API, and the other one is with Scheme. The REST API will be presented today, a scheme will not be presented, and presumably it's just using scheme. At the top, we have profiles, which will be done by external identity management organizations, SDOs. And we have use cases, and people will be presenting 2 use case documents today. So that sort of covers our plan for the day, which obviously is a very busy agenda.
So that segues into doing some agenda bashing. We, of course, are doing that right now. Then we'll have the set token, the token delivery, the management API, which is the REST API, and then we'll go through the risk and skim use cases. Any feedback on the agenda? If not, I guess we can get started with Mike. Figure out how to go and let's see.
Well, good morning, all. I'm Mike Jones from Microsoft and one of the editors of the security event token specification. I liked the airplane better, Dick.
Okay, I can. Now, how do I make that full screen? Where's my little?
Okay. There you go. Next. So we currently have the 3rd working group draft of the document. The functionality has actually been stable for quite a while, most of a year. We bashed it out when it was still draft hunt sec event. And the edits since we last met together in person in Chicago have been to address the issues that were discussed and raised there and have subsequently been discussed on the mailing list. And I do thank people on the mailing list because there has been vigorous and I think well-informed discussions. So I think this has been a productive few months. Next. So what have we done since IETF 98? Those of you who are following the list know that most of the discussion has been about how to prevent confusion between security event tokens and other kinds of tokens that attackers might want you to confuse it with. And in particular, the OpenID Connect ID token received a lot of discussion. And I'm happy to report that we did develop a recommendation or practice to prevent confusion, even if no ID token implementation is ever modified to know about the security event token. Also, as part of the preventing confusion discussion, we worked out a way that had been discussed, in fact, in Chicago and on the list for explicitly typing the JSON Web Token, which represents the security event token. And that being using the existing JOT header named type TYP, which was already in the JOT and really the JSON Web Signature spec for that very purpose. So the new things in our draft are just to register the content type and to describe when and how you might want to use it. Also, partly in response to some discussions that Marius had helped lead, we put a note in the spec explicitly telling people using the set spec that some types of events and profiles might choose to put subject information not at the top level as a JOT claim, but inside the event body. In particular, and this may be esoteric to some of you, but it matters to other use cases. The ID token and I think some access tokens define what's being acted on in the ID token with two claims, the issuer and the subject, where we're naturally using the JOT issuer of the set to say who issued the set. So if you also want to have a claim to represent an issuer that's the thing being acted on, you would put that in the payload. And we explicitly say that, oh, and if there's a subject related to that issuer, you might just want to put that in the payload as well for consistency. Finally, we added a new section on requirements for set profiles, which is not actually new content because it's been widely discussed on the list for most of the time that we have had the mailing list, even before the working group. But it tries to write down as guidance so that people get it right when they're defining an event or a profile with a set of events. Not just that you have to define the syntax of how your event is represented, which is kind of obvious, but just as important, it talks about needing to define the semantics and the validation rules for the data carried in the event. And in particular, one of the most important pieces of semantics that any actionable profile is going to have to define is how to validate that the issuer of the JOT controls the keys or key used to sign the JOT and or encrypt it. Why does that matter? And this is kind of crypto security 101, that if you don't know who controls the keys, anybody could be doing the crypto operation, including parties that you might not want to place a lot of trust in. And so this is not a new set of requirements. This is just writing down in the draft what any sane profile is going to have to do to make it work. And so that recipients of the set know both syntactically and semantically what they need to do to safely process it and use it. Next. So drilling down on a point I mentioned on the previous slide, the way that the draft now says that a set is to be distinguished from an ID token is by not including an expiration claim, which is something that the previous draft already said it's not recommended. Now we're just saying if you're in a context where there could be ID tokens, never do it. Is this a hack? Maybe. But I mean, Marius and others were good advocates of saying practical problems could result if existing systems with ID tokens are extended to add sets, and a set which is from a legitimate issuer could be captured by a malicious party and presented as if it were an ID token with mayhem possibly resulting. The reason this works is it's required in the ID token validation rules to look at the expiration claim. And so if it's not present, any correct ID token processor is going to throw the result away because it's malformed. I'll note, following up on some previous discussion in Chicago and on the list, that this is actually defense in depth, because already in any normal context for an ID token, it's impossible to confuse it, because the set wouldn't have a valid nonce claim with the correct value, which is also necessary for the ID token to be accepted. But now we've got two ways, both of them are fully effective. That should do it for the short term. Next. And we also added the ability to do explicit typing. That's something that, among others, our two chairs in a different role and I had worked on this preliminary JOT BCP, which Kathleen had asked us to do, partly because of the discussions in the SET working group and some related discussions in OAuth. And while the BCP does talk about confusion, there's a gob of other stuff in the BCP talking about ways that people might implement things wrong, ways that people might fail to do checks. So that'll be discussed in the OAuth working group later today, but we invite you to read that. The reason I bring that up now is the explicit typing is something that's in the draft JOT BCP, and the first use of that is in the SET spec at this point. Next. So as I said in my introduction, the functionality, both syntax and semantics, have been stable for most of a year. I believe that the draft does and already has met the needs of all the known use cases that have been discussed. The possible issues with the previous draft have been vigorously discussed, with the results being incorporated into the current working group draft. And while I have a half hour, this is the end of my deck. I'll just say that now I think the right discussion to have, or any other discussions that people want to have at the mic, is it time for working group last call? I'll note that after this draft was published that addressed the known open issues, that about a half dozen people spoke up on the lists and said, yeah, it's time. And I personally concur. It's time to get this done because it already works and it's already in use. Thank you.
Yeah, questions?
Good morning, it's Marius Curtescu. So there's a couple of issues. So let's start with the easier one. There was a discussion on one of the email threads about explicitly identifying the profile in a set, because it's sort of implicitly identified by the event types.
Well, it's explicitly identified by the event type. But go on.
Sure. So you can have multiple events. Now, if the set is not, if the set is mixing events from different profiles, which it shouldn't, but it could, right? Then a parser might be not deterministic because it depends which type it picks up to check the profile. Also, it's not clear how do you map the type URI to a profile. So those things are, I think they are concerns. I think it would be much better to explicitly identify the profile. So I just want to raise this as an issue and the fact that there was a discussion around that. So, and there's a couple more things, but this is the first one.
Okay, and that's something we could describe in the draft more explicitly. I will say that there's profiles for which there's only ever going to be one event. And so adding extra data is just superfluous for those use cases.
All the profiles we look so far, maybe there might be, but most profiles will have multiple events.
I agree. Many
Right.
profiles will have multiple events. And I think rather than having duplication of semantic information, what I would recommend is for a profile that wants to have a gob of events, that it come up with a naming convention where there's a prefix on the event name. So for instance, the risk working group I know in OpenID has discussed having a prefix something like schemas.openid.net/events/risk, and then the event names. And so for a profile that you wanted to do profile identification, it's easy to do that with prefix matching without needing duplicate information. One of the problems I have as a protocol designer with adding redundant information is it introduces the possibility of an inconsistency that was previously impossible. What if, for instance, a malicious or just badly written party was to use the event URI and then say this is in a profile, but one that's not related to that event URI. Because you have this duplication of content, there is an inconsistency in error processing code that you're going to have, whereas if you only have one unambiguous way to determine the information, you've designed the possibility of those mismatch errors out of the system. And so I'd much rather do that.
I think you have the mismatch problem anyhow, right? Because you can have multiple events in a set, and technically the URIs could come from different profiles. So this mismatch issue is there to begin with. The prefix that you suggest, it's practically the profile identifier, right? So maybe one solution is to ask each profile when they define URIs to have a common prefix. I'm not sure, but I think it's something we need to clarify.
We could describe that in the draft if people are interested.
So, right, but I think also considering adding a top-level claim describing the profile, it's a valid requirement, so we should discuss that as well.
Again, adding the top-level claim, I think, introduces the mismatch possibility that's currently impossible.
It's possible. We have mismatch possibility right now.
The draft, I think I know what you're saying. The draft already says that if you have multiple events in the set, that they must be from
the same
a compatible, from a compatible set of events using common syntax and semantic conventions.
I see.
Whether you call that one profile or whether it's a set of profiles all adopting the same conventions is sort of semantics, but practically we normatively say that you must not mix events for which their representations are not compatible.
Okay,
so yes, you could still violate that, but we already have normative text saying you can't do that.
Sure, you could have normative text saying that the profile identifier should match the URIs, like it's the same thing, right? The other thing is, I'm not sure how are we solving the key resolution issue, because I think profiles have to define how the key is resolved, right?
That's right.
In which case, because there is only one signature, we do have only one profile per set. It's a hard requirement. There is no way around that.
No, so you only have one issuer per set.
But it should be only one profile too, because it should be one way to resolve the key, right?
Again, I'm going to quibble with wording because semantics matter.
Right.
That they all have to use the same means of resolving the key. That doesn't mean they're from the same profile. It means that they're sharing the structure of the set.
Right.
I say this because I think there's going to be some identity-related sets that, some are from risk, some are from other working groups, some might be from other identity contexts, but all of them might, for instance, do the key resolution in the same way that OpenID Connect does, where you look up from the issuer a place to get the JWK set. And in fact, that's not just OpenID Connect now. That's also specified in the OAuth metadata document.
Right.
So part of why I wrote down the requirements for profile writers is to capture things like that very point. And I call out that determining key ownership is one of the most important semantic things that you have to say how to do. That said, there's going to be profiles that do it in completely unrelated ways. Just like JOT is now used in some non-identity contexts, including for caller ID, for SIP calls and whatnot, which I only learned about because I happen to be one of the designated experts and they registered the claims. And Sean Turner and I talked about it and I said, okay, that looks great. But their key management is completely different, which is fine. And so sets from that world or from worlds that may not yet exist can and probably will do key resolution in their own ways.
I just want to note one consequence here, which I think we have to live with, is the fact that we won't be able to write a generic set parser and validator without having intimate knowledge of profiles.
Without having what?
Intimate knowledge of profiles, because
That's
the
correct.
signature cannot be validated.
That's always correct, because you must implement the validation rules and the processing rules defined by the event to correctly use the event. So I think anything that tries to be a generic parser can be written, but what it will actually be is a big case statement that may share a bunch of branches for stuff in the same profile. But you have to know what you're processing. There's no sense in which you can generically process an event, or for that matter, a JOT, without knowing the rules syntactically and semantically for how that application uses it.
You're on, Chef, as participant. So I'm a little bit confused because what I had, the model I had in mind for a recipient was to have one big dispatcher that would be able to do some initial work on each and every set, including validating signatures, and then dispatch it to the different profile plugins, for lack of a better word. So is it only my personal model? Do people not share it?
I think that there will be use cases, such as the risk one, where you have a whole bunch of different events processed by a common recipient endpoint. But it still is the case, even for recipients that are intended to process many kinds of JOTs, as a baseline, they have to understand the conventions for securely and correctly retrieving the keys. That's explicitly outside the scope of what a JOT does. It's explicitly outside the scope of what a set does. And so to write that general purpose processor, you have to build in knowledge of the key management regimes for all the sets that you intend to process. Otherwise, you have no security and you don't know how to get the keys.
Okay.
Right, so I think a lot of us, maybe without realizing, we had assumptions rolling around OpenID Connect use cases, which simplifies things. But if you don't have that assumption, then many things don't.
And I'll note, as a practical measure, I would encourage people in the identity world to write a set profile which describes the things that are going to be common for our digital identities, such as how to retrieve keys in the JSON-based world.
So, Leif Johansson. So,
but I don't think that belongs here. That's part of a common profile that might be used by a bunch of identity use cases.
Right. I don't even think that just because you're doing connector, you're going to have the same key management scheme. We're looking at like full mesh key management schemes based on like explicit sort of signed bags of keys use cases, which will certainly not fit into the download your key from HTTPS. So I don't even think that you will be able to sort of do a common profile just because you're doing connect.
Fair point. Let me expand on that just using a little personal knowledge I have of this. Talking with Roland Hedberg in Sweden, who's been very involved in academic federations in the SAML world and now Connect, one of the things that they're doing with this OpenID large-scale federation draft is defining ways to manage the keys where you're not necessarily dependent upon the web PKI for the security of them, where the JWK set thing is explicitly counting on the security guarantees provided by web PKI. So Leif is actually raising a great point that there's people who want different ways to do key management even in identity contexts.
Sure, but you could still have you could have a common profile which defines one way and then
right, and I'd encourage people to write that down.
Right, but you can't assume that just because it says connect that you will do the same key management. I think that was the point Mike was making, right? Key management is a thing that varies even within profiles.
I'm not sure I understood the last thing. Key management varies within profiles. So what profiles are you talking about?
So if you're doing connectors, this thing called is it mobile connector? I think they
from the
do,
GSMA.
right,
Yeah.
GSMA mobile connector. My understanding is that they do key management in slightly different ways than like this. What is sort of the received way of doing key management if you're reading the connect specs, right? So you might be tempted to write a connect profile for set key validation that sort of looks at the specs and do what is suggested that from those specs, from the core specs. But that would certainly not cover a number of use cases that could still claim to be doing OpenID Connect. OpenID Connect is simply too broad to include a unique key management, right?
It's become a big world out there.
Yeah.
Sure. No, I hear you, but you could still write a base OpenID Connect profile, and then you might need other ones that do things differently, right? Or if I understand.
Yeah, you could do a Connect profile that validates the content of the set token, right? But you wouldn't be able to figure out how to validate its authenticity.
Okay, maybe we disagree here, but so my main concern. So the second thing I wanted to raise is that most of the use cases that I've seen so far come from the identity space, right? Or people are trying to solve
from the which space?
Identity space, right? And basically, we're writing a draft which requires all of them to undo some things and do them differently. So from the get-go, we are writing a draft which is not going to work for basically everybody who showed up to do something. Can I finish? Okay. And the thing which is not working, I'm not talking about the second issue I'm raising is the top level single issuer and sub. Right. So for basically most identity use cases, that's not going to work. And one of the solutions, as you suggested, is to push the subject down to the event level. There were other proposals to push it to some other nested level. Another solution that was proposed is to use two different issuer top-level claims, one for the set, one to give context to the subject. But basically, we are creating a draft which, from the beginning, is not going to work for most of the use cases that people right now are trying to solve, right? So I can see two solutions. As you said, maybe we have to write a common profile for identity use cases to cover key management, to cover how the subject is treated. And maybe that's a solution. Or maybe we have to make it flexible enough so we don't contradict all these use cases from the beginning.
I think it is flexible enough now. I'll take exception to your language, and it's probably just wording saying we're writing something that's not going to work. It's not going to work until the event definitions write down where their claims are and how to validate them. And that's true of all claims. It's not just true of issuer or subject. It's true of every claim and data value in the event. So there's nothing, special about subject other than in the particular cases derived from ID tokens, subject is paired with issuer. And if you're going to have an issuer, a connect-like issuer in a set, you would put it in the event body, which we've already said. I think a lot of the sort of angst that I've heard on the list and I'm hearing here will be solved if we write down sort of the one page, this is what connect identity sets that are using the JWKS URI key management discipline would do. And I'd be glad offline to write a first draft of that with you. I don't know where it goes. I don't know that it goes here. It might go in the Connect working group. It might go in the risk working group. I mean, we could sort that later, but I think the parameters of how to do that are pretty well understood, and I suspect that risk already actually has them written down, probably by you.
Okay, so let me rephrase that, because here's my concern. We write a draft which says that we have one issuer and one subject at the top level, and every profile that I'm aware of will have to override that and say, no, subject is not at the top level, it's in this other place, right? And we are at the beginning. When we write such a draft that is not naturally solving the use cases for all the profiles that we are interested in at the beginning, to me that says, okay, we're not doing something right there. That's what I'm trying to say.
I hear you. Let me give an analogy, which again has been discussed on the list, but it's probably worth talking about here as well. Jot took an intentionally very light hand about what's required. We defined how to do the cryptography and how to represent claims, but there are no required claims in a valid Jot. That means that, of course, you're going to have a profile to understand what claims are present and how to use them. This is a good thing. That's why it was possible for instance, the caller ID people and the SIP people to define their own claims and their own key management to use JOTs in a way that's pretty different than an ID token. If we, the same people wrote JOTs as wrote ID tokens. We could have just said, well, all JOTs are going to pretty much be ID tokens and bake a bunch of rules in. But if we did that, we would never have gotten the unanticipated uses in completely different application domains. And I want us to also be able to get these unanticipated use cases from people that, we've never heard of using sets, because they've got the flexibility to likewise match the claims to their needs.
So I'd like to let other people interact here. And you guys are talking past each other. I think, Mike, you're making a valid point, which is we don't want to be overly specific in the token specification. But I don't think that was the point that Marius was making, which is that he thinks that what is specified is something that other profiles would need to change. Marius, I think it would be useful if you, as opposed to making those sort of general positions of saying that it doesn't seem like it's useful the way it is, would be for you to call it exact, precise use cases where you think that a profile will need to override what is in the spec, so that it's clear. to that. And I'm curious if anybody else feels similar to Marius about that.
I don't think it's override. I just think it's add.
I'm using Marius's words, which is
okay, that's fine.
overriding it.
William Dennis. So I was actually going to ask a clarifying question on that.
Sure.
I don't understand why the profile would actually have to override it, because the way I understand how JOT works is that you don't have to include the claim. And the event kind of bucket of claims lets you put whatever you want in there. So to me, it seems like if a profile wants to define something, they can, and they don't really have to undo anything or override anything. So that was a bit like...
Well, I think what Marius is saying is that there's things that are specified as required in SET that profiles would not want to use. Am I phrasing that correctly, Marius?
But do we require sub? No.
SET's not required.
What's
right.
that?
The subject is not required. You can use it or not. It's just like any other claim.
It's permitted but not required. So that's why I don't understand why it needs to be overridden. It's just that you're just opting not to do something that is optional. So that's your right to do. And then you're opting to add something, which is also your right to do in the event.
Is there anything required in a SET?
Events.
Yes, there's the issuer, an audience, and some time-related parameters.
The second clarification I wanted to make is that, Marius, you said that there were no specs that currently define the top-level sub, no profiles, but there actually is a profile. It's the OpenID Connect logout spec that is using that. So I don't agree that no one is doing that.
Okay, so maybe override is not the right word, but basically you write a spec where you say issuer is here, subject optional or is not, it's here, right? And now maybe not the logout, but pretty much all the other profiles will have to say, oh, actually, no, subject is not there. It's over here. Okay, so technically you can argue it's not an override, maybe, but for somebody reading these things, right, like it's an override. Basically saying, no, it's not here, it's over there. And it's not like saying that everybody can define their own claims. These people are not defining new claims. They're just repositioning an existing claim, which is a different thing, right? And yes, logout might be fine with it at the top level, might be. I'm not convinced that for all use cases that will work actually. But many other profiles that's not going to work for them.
See if I understand it. But I think I think this is what I would do if I were to define full mesh key management for I would take the connect profile and say, ignore everything that it says about key management and key validation and just do this instead, right? So I don't think it's necessarily that far from what I hear you wanted to do, Marius.
William Dennis, so I guess if someone is implementing like risk, is that a problem if they're just reading the risk spec? Like I don't quite see that as a bad thing, I guess. Like if that was your reference document and it tells you how to do it. So anyway, I'd like to make a general comment. I think is slightly related to this. So as one of the co-authors, I just want to kind of highlight one of the reasons that we actually wrote this spec almost 2 years ago, 1.5 years ago. And that was that I think when you're using JOT, you need to ensure that all your use cases are mutually unintelligible with the same issuer. So JOT provides, you can partition on the issuer, but if you don't, you have to make sure like every particular type of JOT is mutually unintelligible. And I think we achieve that here with event. And I think the real value of this spec is then allowing all of those subclasses of event, like risk and like logout, to kind of coexist with ID tokens. And I think that's a valuable achievement. And I think it's also a reason to get this done soon, because if we kind of dally around too long, then all those people that are thinking of profiling this may just move on and profile themselves, and then we lose that benefit of kind of having this world where you can have an issuer that only knows about ID tokens and events and is happy that that's a secure and safe environment. So that's kind of the value of doing it this way. Just want to make that point.
Dick Hart as participant. So one of the values of a framework would be to enable implementations to people to implement and do some piece of code that's going to be common that other people can reuse, right? So we've got that for JOTs. The idea for SET would be there would be another layer that would go and do some things that are required or common there. I worry a bit if there's a bunch of things that are optional and if they're in different places, that then you can't have a common implementation that does all of that so people don't have to worry about that. I also have a concern with the methodology on signaling which profile a particular set is for. And then, as I've participated in some of the profiles at a higher level, it seems that at times you could have messages for different profiles potentially mixed into some of the same place. And so I think it's key to have a clear way of knowing which profile particular set is with. And I think parsing the start of a event in some sort of hand wavy way of saying how you figure that out is not nearly as robust as a clear signal of which profile a set belongs to. And potentially, as opposed to having the type field be for set, the type field could be for a particular profile of set. And so you've got a clear signal at the type level as opposed to in the event. And that way the event is really orthogonal to the profile, which would allow different profiles to use the same type of event type.
Responding to that particular point, which I've thought about since you talked about it with me in person yesterday, the problem with that is if people like the risk people or others want to have a common processor, you actually want them to have a common type. Otherwise, they'll be using the type and rejecting things that they actually want to include.
If they want a processor that's going to consume more than one profile, then they can see, is it one of those two profiles? That seems fairly straightforward, right?
Also possible.
Nice, easy string compare.
And I'll note, well, I thought I would go under time. The discussion has now taken us over. So if you want to time manage this, but
we thought it was useful discussion, so we let it continue on.
Okay, now just one more clarification. I'm not sure if it was understood what I was trying to say. Yes, it's okay for a profile to override where sub is. It might not be an override, it might be specification. I understand that. If there was only one profile doing this, I think it was fine. And maybe it's going to end up winning one profile. My suspicion is there's going to be lots of profiles which will have to do the same thing. Right? That's the only thing I want to say.
And having lots of profiles to me is a sign that we did it right.
William Dennis again. But sub is also defined in JOT, right? So in any case, you're quote overriding JOT. But we know we have profiles that need it. So like logout is using. I think conceptually, though, it makes sense. If anyone didn't hear Marius, he was saying that logout is doing it that way, but doesn't have to. But I don't see the problem. I think conceptually, it's using JOT the way JOT was defined. It's using sub the way sub was defined in JOT, which to me makes sense.
Yeah, having a discussion across the room is not going to be productive for people that aren't here. I'm sorry. So how many people in the room, if we can get a show of hands, everyone looking at their laptop, pay attention. Who all's had a chance to read and review this spec?
Maybe 10.
The pillars.
Yeah, sort of 10.
Put hands up over there.
Okay. If you can't see me, I can't see you. Okay. Okay. So about 10, it looked like. Sorry, lift your hands again. Now we know. One. Is that kind of half a hand? It's about 9 people.
Yeah, with us, it's about 10.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So
we're kind of wondering, we're kind of on the edge as to whether we're ready to do last call on this or not. Be useful if there was more people that had sort of read it to get more feedback. And
so can I make a suggestion? So it sounded to me on the discussion there that some of the sort of bigger pushback is sort of on the overall aims of and architecture of the document. I mean, whether you're going to focus on the profiles or not, right? And if that's the kind of pushback that you're seeing, maybe it would be better to sort of ask for more. That's not detailed edits, right? That's not, give me text, right? That's a complete rewrite. That's a refocus of the draft if you're going to do that, right? And I think if you're seeing that kind of pushback, I think that should come with text. That should come with a separate draft. I think if you're in the camp that thinks we shouldn't have to rely on profiles as much, those people should actually produce a separate draft. Because I think that's a major rewrite.
Oh, that wasn't that wasn't the conclusion I had, but I would agree with your statement. But
but I don't think necessarily you have that much pushback. But if you sort of have that kind of pushback, I think that's a major rewrite of a draft like this, and it doesn't really help you whether you go to last call on this draft or not, right? You're going to have to, if somebody has that kind of feedback, go and write a separate draft, and then we can talk about it, I think.
Well, agreed. If this isn't solving somebody's problem, then potentially there needs to be something else to solve the problem, and this is the wrong tool for the job.
Yep.
Right. Yes.
Kathleen Moriarty, Area Director. So I think once you make the decisions, and you know what they are already, 10 reviewers is fine, is all I wanted to say. So I don't think you need many more people, but 10 is fine in terms of what I see across other working groups.
Okay.
As long as they actually review and provide some feedback.
So for me, it was clear from the get-go that we will need profiles, that we will be relying on profiles to fill in details for each and every use case. So at least what I'm hearing from the mailing list and from this discussion is that there are some points missing, but not at the level of complete re-architecture.
William Dennis, one comment just on the timing. I think we've sort of been going around for a while. The draft has been pretty stable, I think, for a while, and there has been some of these lingering questions. I don't want to see that uncertainty persist for years and us never getting complete. So I think if the decision is today not to do a working group last call, I'd really like to see a decision on what the plan is to get there. Because if we just punted another 4 months, I just don't think. I think we'll be back here arguing about the same points again, and we'll have the same indecision. And if that indecision is used as the reason not to go to working group last call, we'll just perpetually have indecision.
Yeah. Well, I on the plus side, we're talking about completely different things in the last meeting. The core thing I see is sort of the signaling on which profile the set is on, and there seems to be some discussion on that. As sort of what I've captured as being the outstanding thing. I'm unclear on Marius's points as to how those are not something specified at the profile level versus in the set level. But why don't we get a consensus in the room? What do you want to do? A little hum?
Yeah, so let's do a hum on working group last call. I will be asking 2 questions, whether we do want to go for working group last call or not. Whoever is in favor of working group last call on this draft, please hum. If you are opposed to working group last call at this time on this draft, please hum. That's kind of clear. Thank you.
Okay.
Jeff Hodges gives a thumbs up.
Yeah. So we'll run that over the list.
You had 2 questions?
Those were the 2, I think. Yes. Okay. Thank you, Mike. And next up we have Marius on the distributed
with HTTP.
Yeah. And thank you again all for the vigorous discussion on the list. It's been really helpful to refine stuff.
And we are 15 minutes behind, so.
Right, so I'm Marius Curtescu. I'll be talking about delivery of sets. So we have a draft which looks at two ways to deliver sets. One is push initiated by the transmitter and a poll initiated by a receiver, and also defines a verification process for event streams. I have some definitions. I'm going to skip through them. If we need them, we can talk about them later on the other slides. So the event delivery.
Does that show up down there?
All right. Thank you. So first of all, the way the sets are defined and how the streams are assigned to sets is out of scope for this draft. The event receiver has to register with the transmitter a delivery mechanism, and that's how they are delivered in the stream. There are two defined. One is push, as I mentioned, an HTTP post to an endpoint defined by the event receiver, and poll, where the transmitter is queuing the events up in a buffer, and then the receiver is doing a periodic poll to retrieve them. And also has to be noted that other methods of delivery can be defined outside of this draft. Another important note is that the event receiver has to acknowledge receipt of the events, and a transmitter is not required to store the events after they have been acknowledged. So the first method is the push delivery. It's a very simple HTTP post to a configured endpoint. We have the content type, the accept header, that's the response content type. It's important to know there's only one set per push, per request. The defined HTTP status code 202, it's also the acknowledgement that the set was received. And in case of an error, there are other HTTP status codes to signal that. Here's a very simple request example. And then there are two response examples, a success one, which is trivial, and an error response, which is a JSON blob. Also important is the 400 status code in this case, and then the JSON blob with two fields, error and description, and these are defined in a slide further down. The other delivery method is polling. So the receiver is doing HTTP post to both acknowledge and get more sets and this to an endpoint which is defined by the transmitter. You have the content type, both request and response are JSON. In this case, multiple sets can be streamed at once as opposed to only one. And also in the request, there are some polling parameters we are going to look at. So there are two, so these are the request attributes. So there are some processing parameters, max events, and return immediately. Max event 0 means that the receiver is only acknowledging sets received in the previous request, and it's not requesting new sets. And return immediately allows for long poll. And also the request can have two arrays, an ACK array, which specifies all the sets that have been successfully received, and then a set errors, which is another array which defines all the sets that had errors, and then there is a nested JSON object there describing the error which each of those sets. The response has a bigger array sets which contains all the new sets that are to be delivered to the receiver, and then there is a Boolean flag signaling that there more are available. Playing with the request attributes, the receiver can have all kinds of variations on how it's polling, so it can poll only. So that means it just requests new sets and it's not acknowledging anything, or it can acknowledge only, or have a combination of both. And here is an example of a combined request where it acknowledges some of the previous ones, signals some errors, and it's asking for long poll. And the response, it's sending the list of new sets. These are the error codes. It's split on 2 pages. Next page. Yeah. Also, the draft defines a way to verify events. It's basically the receiver can trigger to the control plane, which is out of scope for this spec, but it can request the transmitter to send a verification set, a verification message. And in that request, it can specify both a confirm and a nonce value. And as a response to that request, the transmitter will deliver a verification event. And here is an example. The URI for this event type has to be defined, but it's a very simple event. It has nested attributes for the confirm and nonce as they were sent by the receiver. Just a few notes. In Chicago, I think it was mentioned it's important to specify authentication authorization, and it's just standard methods used by HTTP, and some examples are given, but it's up to the transmitter and the receiver, the transmitter probably for the transmitter to document which authentication authorization method it's using, and the client, the receiver, to support that.
So can I ask a question on the error?
Sure.
So duplicate is an error, but it also says it has been ignored. So why even make it an error?
That's a good point. I don't know. Maybe just to signal to the, yeah, I'm not sure.
I would, doesn't matter. I mean, if you're doing, if the sender is duplicating stuff and you don't care, right? Why even tell? I mean, you could have another class of feedback saying, hey, I've notification or something, informative message or something, right? But if it's just a convenience, log it and let the sysadmin figure out why you're sending duplicates, but you don't have to sort of trigger error on the client side, on the sender side, I think.
Yes, we can look into it. I don't know, like it gets interesting because the transmitter has to keep events queued up until they are acknowledged. If you keep acknowledging them and they keep sending them, then maybe you should send an error here. It's useless to keep sending them to me because...
Absolutely, but if I'm sending them twice, it's because I didn't sort of get the ACK, right?
Possibly.
Unless I have a serious bug in my code.
Right.
Right. But I can figure that out from logs too, I guess.
Fair enough.
I think debugging should be out of scope.
Fair enough. Okay. Yeah, I think that's all I have for questions.
So 2 quick questions. You said in passing that...
Can you say who you are, please?
Yaron Sheffer. You said in passing that you can send multiple events at the same time with a poll facility, but not with push. Why is that?
Why is that? Because in a push, you can act easily with an HTTP status code. If you send multiple at once, then you cannot rely on the HTTP status code anymore. You need to send back a JSON blob, and it complicates the way the acknowledgement work. And for example, for a server for a transmitter pushing events, the way they do monitoring and alerts is going to be affected because they cannot rely on HTTP status codes anymore. It gets way more complicated, right?
If I have a reasonably good network and I'm just concatenating 10 JSON structures into one body, one HTTP body, and just send the whole thing, why wouldn't it work?
I'm not saying it's not going to work. The problem is so we had this discussion on the mailing list. The transmitter will have a harder time to do monitoring and alerts in this case, right? Because if you keep pushing individual sets, then you can have your alerts and monitoring based on HTTP status codes. If you have multiple in one payload, then you cannot rely on the status code anymore. You need to be able to parse the JSON and extract multiple error levels from a lower level, right? It gets more complicated.
Okay, but the question behind the question is we're moving the complexity into this whole poll thing,
right?
Which I think is much more complex than we could have done with just using push with post.
So the need for a poll is because there are receivers who are behind a firewall and they cannot be contacted with HTTP, right? So they need to reach out. The transmitter cannot reach to the receiver in that case. So there are use cases which require poll. Push is not going to work for them.
Okay, actually the firewall thing is not very convincing to me because you are expecting to receive events from the outside, so you should be able to set up an external IP, but well,
yeah, that was a motivator. Some people had a use case where the receiver was not
so yes,
available.
It's a real use case. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Maybe the document could call that out more clearly why poll exists in it.
That's a good point. Okay.
Annabelle Beckman. A few questions and comments. Building on the earlier comment about the duplicate error code, it's not clear to me what we're expecting a transmitter to do in response to these error messages, the error codes that it's receiving from the receiver. Looking through them, most if not all of them seem like the sort of errors that are not going to be remedied through some alternative code path. At best, the transmitter is going to resend the event, which is going to result in the same error. The only other alternative really is for them to log it, pipe it into a messaging or a error logging system, something like that. I'm not sure how valuable that is versus alternative existing out-of-band troubleshooting mechanisms.
Right, fair enough. So from practical experience, I think logging is the only thing that the transmitter can do at that point. But having a detail of what went wrong from the receiver's point of view, it's very valuable later when you do the troubleshooting. Right?
Okay. I think it would be helpful to, in the spec, make clear what the expectations are, what expectations a receiver should have about what a transmitter is going to do in response to these error messages. Should make sure that implementers have a reasonable expectation of what the behavior is going to be when they implement that.
Fair enough. There are other errors where retry might actually work. There might be some overlap when a key rotation is done, and for a while it cannot verify the signatures, and then it starts working again. I don't know, but there are...
Sure.
Yes.
The other question I had is, we have the pull and push mechanisms defined in the same draft. If I understand correctly, the expectation is that a transmitter would implement both in all cases. Is that correct?
Maybe it's not spelled out explicitly. We'll have to check that. I think the expectation is the transmitter implements both, and then receivers, whichever works for them.
Is it necessary to do that? Do we need to couple them together like that?
Oh, instead of splitting them into two?
Right. I mean,
in other words, to be compliant, you need to implement both, or can you decide which one you want to implement or choose between?
Something we have to discuss. I think it came up before, and the conclusion was that we said the transmitter will have to implement both to be compliant, but maybe we shouldn't go there.
The pull mechanism involves a lot more complexity on the part of the transmitter, which may not be worthwhile if in a particular use case there are not going to be any clients who need it.
I could be wrong. I'll have to double check. Maybe right now the draft mentions that it's optional actually the pull. So.
Okay. On a similar note, the more available response parameter, it also adds complexity on the transmitter side.
Yes.
I don't see the value of it, given that a client is a receiver is always going to have to handle the possibility that they make a request and there are no events returned.
kind of agree. The only case where it's kind of useful is if the receiver, let's say, polls every 5 minutes, but if it's more available, stays in a loop until exhausts all the events. But yeah,
Right.
the receiver could do the same thing. It can poll until receives nothing and then waits 5 minutes.
Right.
So I agree. Yeah.
Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Tony Nadlin, we have definitely use cases for polling only. And so we would definitely like to see it as two separate things. That we don't have to implement poll. We don't have use cases for poll very much.
Makes sense. So two separate ones means split it into drafts, or the drafts should specify that one, either one or the other.
I don't want to see them. I don't want to see the draft split.
Right.
I'd rather see it as one, but this just be either one be an option.
Sufficient. Okay.
Yes. But you have to implement one of them.
Right.
Well, the point is not to save our time with the specification. The point is to have an interoperable draft. And in my opinion, if we split it in two, we're not going to have an interoperable draft. So if we say that they are optional for both senders and receivers, we're not going to have interoperable implementations. So it's an issue for me. Why?
So you just disagree?
Because we will have some that only do this one and some that only do this one, and they will not interoperate with the other guys.
Okay, thank you.
So given that this is on our charter and most of this has been around already and we've just cut it out and massaged it, we would like to call for working group adoption of this draft. So we will have a hum on that. I will ask Kathleen?
No, I'm going to stand over here because I might get different
acoustics.
You'll get over there, yeah.
Thank you. So I will ask for yes hum and a no hum. People who are in favor of adopting the HTTP delivery draft as a working group document, please hum now. People who think we should not be adopting this as a working group document, please hum. Okay, we're adopting the draft. Thank you, Marius.
All right, great. Thank you, Marius. Next up, we have Annabelle. And,
Right. Do we have slides? Hey, we have slides. Cool.
okay.
Hey, good morning. I'm Annabelle Backman. I'm going to be talking about the other side of the set space, that is the management, a simple management API for event streams. Specifically, what we're talking about here is codifying the way that receivers can manage this stream of events that they're receiving from a transmitter. We, in discussions, have identified 4 specific operations that receivers are going to need to perform. Those are what the spec is currently focusing on. You can see them listed there. We have querying the status of a stream, adding subjects to a stream, removing subjects, and requesting verification, the other side of the verification event that Marius mentioned in his draft. To be clear, when we're talking about adding subjects and removing subjects, what we're talking about there is a receiver indicating to a transmitter that this particular subject is one they are interested in receiving events about, or not interested in receiving events about. What we are not focusing on in this draft is anything relating to registration of the receiver itself with the transmitter, any of the credential management, key resolution kind of problems that Mike discussed, things of that nature. Next slide. The big key here is we realize that these profiles are going to be implemented, not in a vacuum. They're going to be implemented alongside existing mechanisms or existing protocols like SCIM, OpenID Connect that already define ways to do a lot of this stuff: registration, authentication, identification of clients. We can't reinvent that at the set level and expect people to follow that. So we ultimately need to leave a lot of that up to the implementing profiles to define. Next. So briefly, we've thrown out the term set event streams a few times. Just to get everyone on the same page, we're talking about a relationship between a transmitter and a receiver, where there's a flow of events from the transmitter to the receiver over some delivery method, such as the ones that Marius just presented.
As a quick
Yes.
comment there, both the word feed and stream are being sort of bandied about in various drafts. It might be good to harmonize the terminology. I like stream better.
Agreed. I think there's been a lot of back and forth in the past on terminology here. I think there's starting to be a consensus around streams, but there are likely places in drafts that have not been updated to use that terminology.
Well, to be clear, that feeds and streams were actually different, but that was confusing because people thought they were the same thing.
Anyway, the other thing to note about event streams as relate to the management API, according to this spec, we're saying that there is one event stream between a given receiver and a transmitter. Next. The other, one object or one entity that the specification has to define for us is something called a subject identifier object. This gets to some of the earlier discussions of the various ways that subjects need to be identified by different profiles. In OpenID Connect Logout, they are going to be defining subjects using issuer and sub. In RISC, we might be using that. An event might be using a phone number, an email address. Other profiles could be doing all sorts of things. So if the management API is going to be dealing in adding and removing subjects, we need to define ways to say what are those subjects. How do we know who that subject is? So what we're saying here is we have a subject identifier object that is a JSON object containing a set of claims that uniquely identifies a subject, and that profiling specs are going to define for us. So if RISC wants issuer and sub as a subject, or phone number or email as subjects, then the RISC profile would define those as different subject identifier objects for use with the management API. Next. Just to add some clarify what I'm talking about here. Here are a couple of examples that you might see from RISC events. So let's talk about the actual API. The transmitter implements an HTTP set of HTTP endpoints that the receiver calls. Again, these are event stream management, which is the query endpoint, add subject, remove subject, and request verification. The spec states that these are independent URLs. They may be the same URLs for multiple streams, or a transmitter may define separate endpoints for each of these for each stream. That is up to the implementer. Next. Reading stream configuration is just a HTTP GET. Next. You can see the simple example. There's really not much to it. Next. And our response is a JSON object containing claims describing the delivery method defined for the stream, as well as an optional events claim that lists the event types that may be transmitted over the stream. This is a may. There's no guarantee that the transmitter will actually send any of these events to the receiver. They are just possibilities. Next. Adding a subject and removing a subject are likewise pretty straightforward. HTTP posts containing a subject identifier object in the body and expect to get a 204 no content back on success. Next. We see here we have an example using an email address based subject identifier object. Next. Next. Like I said, remove is basically looks the same. Next. We're just posting to a different endpoint. Next. Verifying stream configuration is again simple. HTTP post to a verification endpoint. This contains a JSON object that may contain a state parameter. It looks like there's going to have to be some harmonization between this and what's in the HTTP delivery spec as far as what's required for a verification event and what we need, what the receiver needs to send in this request. So this may need to change. Important thing to note about verification, though, is that it is expected to happen completely asynchronously. A receiver is going to make a request to the verification endpoint to ask for a verification event, and the transmitter will be expected to send that event at some time in the near future. The receiver should not expect that that will happen before the transmitter responds to the verification endpoint request. Here we see another, again, simple example request and response. Lastly, yeah, we can go to next. Lastly, the error reporting is just using standard HTTP error codes. Next. Okay, any questions on that?
Your Honor, for 2 comments. One of instead of for explicit endpoints, I think it would be nice if we had a directory endpoint from which I could get a JSON with the 4 endpoints. And then my other comment is if we end up with an explicit profile claim or profile signal, I think we should replace the list of events here with a list of profiles. That would be, I believe, cleaner and easier to handle.
So just to make sure I understand your first point, it sounds like you're talking about discovery type of mechanism for the endpoints.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's worth discussing. To your other point, my only concern about that would be if there are use cases where a transmitter will only be sending a subset of events that are defined within a profile over a particular stream, and if there's a need to be able to indicate that. Off the top of my head, I'm not 100% clear that that use case exists, though, so be interested to hear if anyone has that in mind.
Looks like good topic for the list.
Yeah, Maris Cortez, go ahead. Yeah, there are definitely use cases where only some events will be sent, but yeah, we can discuss that separately.
Cool. I will look forward to the email thread.
All right. Just as a note, so we have to decide which control plane approach we are going to use, either this one or one based on scheme. I'm just wondering how we're going to move forward, move with this one. When are we going to decide, or how are we going to do that?
Is there a requirement to have only one control plane?
That's a good point. Yeah. So we want to have multiple ones or define one?
Well, it seemed the SCIM people were keen to use SCIM as a control plane, and the non-SCIM people were thinking that didn't work for them.
Okay.
That may be more clear as we go through the risk and SCIM use cases as well.
All right. And then we're going to keep the drafts separate, like the delivery and from the control plane. I think, as was decided, that we're going to have a separate draft just for the control plane. Is that correct?
We've got an ID on the control plane, or the management API, and we have an ID on that you just presented on delivery.
Right. But the
we
ID
have a working group document now.
Of course.
Right.
But the ID for the control plane can be considered just a temporary one and could be merged back into the draft. So that was one possibility we discussed about.
Could be, but potentially it makes sense for SCIM people to have a different control mechanism, but have a common delivery mechanism.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, I think given that we're looking at having N number of delivery mechanisms and M number of control planes potentially, there's value in keeping them separate.
Kathleen Moriarty, Area Director. Just a request, if the working group does decide to go ahead with multiple control planes, I think documenting the architecture and applicability for each of these might be very helpful. And what I would suggest is just starting out simple with you can use the data tracker working group wiki and keep track of this. And then maybe when the working group is closer to final, taking what you've pulled together there and putting together an overview document. Overview documents seem to be well received in the IESG right now, as opposed to some other formation documents. And that would be more towards the end where you have all of this stuff defined and you can show how everything fits together. But if you use that as a collection point to guide the work and prioritize it, especially with multiple options, it could be useful.
Good. Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
I was going to ask where should we put that, and then you answered the question. So.
Trying to make it easy where everyone can log in.
If only the ISG provided a tool to convert my architecture slide into ASCII art, that would be great.
There are tools on the internet to do that.
If there's no other
Any
questions.
other questions? Do you want to adopt?
Thank you.
Too early? Really? Yes. Should we ask people? You don't want to ask people?
No, go ahead and ask.
So the distribution had been sort of part of something that had been in this working group for a while and factored out of a previous ID. The management API is a relatively new piece of work. Looking to get a sense in the room as to whether we're ready for this to be a working group document or whether we need to do more work on that. So what do I do? Ask two questions. You've done it every time. This is my first time.
Go do it.
Okay, I'll ask two questions. One, a hum for who would like it to be. Okay. So first one on hum as to whether we're ready to adopt this as a working group document, and another hum for no, we're not ready. For hum if you're ready to adopt this as a working group document. And hum if you think we need more work on this. Which was half and half.
Oh, you put half and half.
Yeah.
Oh, there was very clear that it
Second
was
sounded louder to me.
much louder, yeah.
Okay.
And you gotta stop
That's
putting this mic.
Okay, so looks like we need another turn on that.
Okay.
And so I guess whatever we need to fix on that, if we can make sure we're clear on the, well, there's a different question, which is, should we have this as a document? Should we have a control plane? well, as opposed to not, right? Like, should we be doing this? I mean, it's in the charter, but is it worth another term? Should we continue to do work on this? So, Hum, if we should continue to do work on this.
Wait, maybe we should, if it wasn't clear from their presentation, can maybe Annabelle or Mario stand up and say in a few words why this is important, why you're spending the time on this, why we should have it as a draft?
Sure. So can I just ask, I mean, you're doing, this is an individual draft at this point, right? The working group doesn't need to make decisions on the individual drafts, right?
Correct.
Yeah, just keep working, right?
Sure, but wouldn't it be useful to know whether you're beating your head against the wall or it's something that...
Right. I mean, that's a different... So that's a different question. That's a sort of almost a charter question. Do you think the working group should be focusing on this type of problem, right? That's a valid question, right?
And if I was at that, my Kathleen Moriarty area director, it could also be at this time, right? You could take on this work later.
This is Barry Leva. I suggest the question then is, if you hummed for no, should we reconsider that after a turn or two of the document or not? You know, is your no not yet, but maybe later, or is your no, let's forget about it? That's really the next question.
Right. Well, why I'm asking that is there wasn't a bunch of negative feedback about the document, but there was a hum for no.
Right. So that may mean that nobody cares about it, and they should just go off and do whatever they're going to do on their own. But it would be better to ask the working group, would you consider adopting it in the future, in the near future?
Right.
So, you know, so they know.
Right.
So,
are you going to make me do it again?
All right. So, I will ask two questions. Whether you think this document could be adopted after, say, 1 or 2 revisions and review on the list and possibly in the next meeting, or whether you think this is work that's inappropriate or uninteresting for this group to work on.
Could I make a suggestion for a simpler question? Just ask the working group whether they think that management APIs should be in scope for the working group.
Fair enough.
Then that's a baseline, right? You know.
Yeah, but I will still qualify it a little bit. So I will ask the group if the management API, as exemplified in this draft, is in scope for the group or not. So if you think this management API of the sort we've just seen is in scope for the group, please hum. And if you think the management API is not in scope for the group, please hum. Okay, in scope, but not yet ready. Thank you. Marius, you're back.
Okay, use cases. So we're going to look at risk use cases, the ones we identified so far. Yeah. So, and the reason we're looking for these use cases is to have a set of requirements for the other drafts. I'm going to skip over the, go back. It's just for most of the definitions. I just want to highlight the definition of an explicit IDP to RP relationship and implicit, because it shows up a lot in the use cases. And I think Yaron pointed out that if you don't understand that, the use cases don't make sense. So an explicit IDP to RP relationship, it's where when the RP is registered with the IDP and the user is going through an OAuth2 flow. So basically the IDP has an OAuth2 grant for the user and for the RP. And the implicit use case is when the RP is using an identifier like an email or phone number, and the IDP is the one controlling it. And that identifier can be used in a recovery flow. So implicitly you have the IDP-RP relationship. It's not explicit through some OAuth grants. All right, so first use case, it's the simplest one when you have the explicit IDP to RP event flow. The transmitter is the IDP, the receiver is the RP. The IDP can expose a control plane, and the RP can make, or the management API can make API calls to it, and it can authenticate with access tokens because the RP has those. The second one is the reverse one, where the RP is sending events back to the IDP. I just gonna make a note in this case that this is the use case when where we have the issuer conflict. One requirement for this use case, or nice to have feature, is to make it easy for RPs to participate in the interaction without complicated crypto if possible. Because the RP can identify itself with an access tokens, we are exploring the idea that maybe in this case the sets don't need to be signed. We'll have to look at the security implications of that. The IDP can document the endpoint for the data plane, and the RP can simply start posting events to that endpoint. Of course, the RP can have full transmitter functionality. That's another case. Now we have the use case of an implicit IDP to RP. So the first point is that the two entities need some legal agreement, because it's not clear to the user that there is a relationship between them. Just because I logged into a website and I'm using my email address, it's not clear to me that the email provider should send risk events to the website where I logged in. Also, this sets requirements for the management API. So the add, remove subject operations are coming from this use case, because the RP needs to make these use cases in order to start receiving risk events. And there is an assumption made for this use case that the RP is registered with the IP as an OAuth2 client, even though the users don't participate in the dance. So for the control plane, access tokens can be used. Yes?
Can you just jump back one slide?
Back?
There are, I just want to note there that in this case, since the OP is registering with the RP, right, that sort of adds potentially adds significant complexity for the RP, because you have to manage state you have to manage a lot of these relationships, right? Am I missing something?
So in this case, you already have a relationship established between them, right? The RP, it's an OAuth2 client to the IDP and all that.
Yes, but aren't you turning this around, right? In this case, the IDP needs to be a OAuth client of the RP.
No, that's not turned around.
Okay, so all right.
Maybe
I'm misreading that.
Sorry, you're right. So that's in the last paragraph. So if the RP wants to have a full transmitter functionality, then that needs to be happen.
Exactly.
But that's why in the first two paragraphs said the requirements to try to make it easier and not have that requirement.
Right. And what I was trying to get to is that part of the work on key management work that we've been talking to Mike about, right, is to get away from the need for a lot of symmetric crypto. So it would be nice if one could sort of call out in some of these use cases where key management sort of comes into the profile, right? Because or where the complexity trade-off between push and pull might come into this, right? Because I could sort of naively say that in this case, maybe it's worth doing poll because you don't have to have this sort of reverse security relationship.
The push-pull relationship is a good one. We haven't thought about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where sort of poll might actually be worth it if then I don't have to have the IDP registered as an OAuth client to the RP.
Right.
A few of these considerations maybe it might be worth putting into the use case document to sort of, because it actually informs sort of your implementation choices.
Yes, thank you. One more. Okay, so open questions for the implicit one. What are the implications of unverified identifiers like unverified email addresses? That's an important one. And the other one is discovery. How does the RP find the correct IDP for a given identifier? So if you have an RP, and in some cases might be easy to map to email addresses to who the provider is, but in other cases it's not easy, and we might need to. So these are problems to be solved for this use case.
Sure, but those are at the risk level as opposed to at the set level.
Right.
Right.
And then the reverse is the implicit RP to the IDP. In this case, no enrollment call is strictly necessary because the RP has the user identifier already, so it could simply notify the IDP directly. But still, the open question is there enrollment necessary? It might be based on implementation, like each RP or IDP might decide on that. And also, again, we have the assumption that the IDP is registered with the RP as an OAuth2 client and can use access token. And this is the reverse one again. So there's a pseudo-implicit use case. So you have two different websites, and they happen, as an example, and they both use email addresses as main identifiers. And technically, they could do cross-discovery to see if they have common users and then start sending risky events between them. Obviously, there's legal agreements, and there are open questions about legal and privacy implications for this. The identity as a service use case. So you have identity as a service. So you have one entity managing many RPs at once. So this identity as a service could technically automatically do the configuration with all the corresponding IDPs on behalf of the RPs. And the assumption for identity as a service is that the identity as a service provider can impersonate the RP at an IDP, so it can obtain access tokens on behalf of the RP. Very similarly, security as a service, the main difference is that in this case, the service provider cannot impersonate the RP, and there are some delegation rules, so the IDPs will accept some requests, but they know that they talk to a different entity and not to the RP. So this complicates all the use cases, all the control planes, and then how the signaling would work, because now the management API will have to explicitly become aware. So I think what currently we have proposals for a management API are not covering this use case. I'm not sure if this is a use case we will want to service or not, but it's one important to note. And on-premise RP, so this is the one that is requiring polling because they are sitting behind a firewall, and push to an HTTP endpoint is not possible. And that was it. Questions?
Yaron Sheffer, sorry. Could you clarify again what security as a service means? What is happening?
Right, so maybe the name is not right, but you have a service provider which provides services for many RPs. In one case, they can impersonate the RP in the sense in an OAuth2 terminology, they have the client ID and secret of the RP. They can obtain access tokens or some other means. They can get access tokens and at management API endpoints, they show up as being the RP, right? The management API doesn't know the difference. In the other use case, the security as a service, maybe it's not the right name, but the number 7, they don't provide full IDP or RP implementation, but they provide other security, but they do still manage a large number of RPs. But in this case, they cannot obtain access tokens on behalf of them. And in all cases, when they make an API call, they have to identify them as themselves, as being, I'm the service provider. And the IDP will have to, or whoever manages that management API, they have to understand that there are some delegation ACLs there, and they are allowed to make calls on behalf of the RP.
Are there examples of this?
Phil has examples of this. The requirements comes from Oracle and Phil Hunt, so I'm not aware of these examples directly, but I just captured some.
That seems like a.
In general, there are examples of delegation when you make API calls. When you make an API, I have clear examples where you make an API call and you say, I want to make the API call as if I was Descartes, but I'm not Descartes. And then the receiver will have to make sure that I'm allowed to make those calls on your behalf. So basically, the delegation, it's clear to the implementer of the API, right?
So would it be correct to call it risk assessment as a service or something like that?
Right. Is it that different from security? Maybe.
Well, security is kind of.
It's too wide. Okay. Yes. Sure. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. Next up is one of our favorite presenters, Tony.
Okay, I'm just going to present, this is draft 00, and this is the SCIM use cases for scenarios. There's some pre-assumptions here, which is we use SCIM triggers, and they are things that we use to make sure that we can keep track of all the events that go on within SCIM processing. We also assume the SCIM security model that's documented in SCIM, and then we also have a privacy aspect to it to make sure, because we are sending information, we are sending updates, security information around the net here. Next. And so we actually have 3 use cases. The first one is a push use case. The second one will be a pull, and the third is a mobile SMS and stuff like that. But they're pretty simple use cases. Basically, the SCIM client you have down there is going to issue commands over to the SCIM service provider. We assume that all the security and tokens have been set up correctly. This is, we believe, out-of-band stuff that needs to get done. And then so the SCIM processing client controller will send SCIM security commands such as update users and things like that. And it will also do the event commands at the same time. So we may want to be notified of, things that have changed with a particular user or stuff like that. So that gets also done through that aspect. And then the SCIM event stream is going to kick off push events down to the back to the SCIM client if it detects that the triggers have been pulled and you need events to be set. Next. And then we also need a polling in this particular case because we have a firewall situation here. And we also may only want, we may also want to have the client tell it when it wants to receive updates. It may not be advantageous to have it pushed all the time. So there needs to be a pull mechanism here. But the use cases, the flows are the exact same situation. And the last one is basically the same. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Next slide.
Yes, that's what I said. And so the last one is just we have a mobile situation, and the events may come over SMS or some other mobile means instead of coming over through HTTP types of events. So those are the three basic skim cases that we have. We've implemented the second case where the long polling, and we do directory synchronization via that.
A comment, Yaron Sheffer, a comment to both drafts actually. There's a major mismatch in terminology, and so someone coming from the outside will not, in my opinion, be able to know whether the specific use case is appropriate for this solution, and maybe both. So could you add to these three use cases some wording using the terminology in the other draft, such as implicit IDP, RP, and so on? And on the other hand, could the authors of the other draft please say whether stuff is appropriate for the cloud, for the enterprise, for mobile?
Yes, Tony?
Yes, Dick.
You'll do that.
If I was an author of this, I would, but
You're just the straight man.
just the straight man here.
I have a question about...
Please identify yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Dr. Michael B. Jones. I work at Microsoft. I actually have a question about the control plane aspects of the delivery of messages through SCIM and the related events. As you're viewing the architecture, is that already implicit because of the SCIM context?
Yes, that's
so
correct.
You wouldn't need a distinct control plane as Annabelle described, because that's
already
you get that for free somehow.
You get that because in the SCIM service provider, that's what we've got. So you have to implement that for SCIM. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Annabelle Backman, on a clarifying question. So in the mobile scenario, you're actually looking at transmitting events via SMS, not just via mobile push?
Yes, correct. I mean, that's it could be expanded to the mobile push, but that's our current usage.
And the reason I ask is the way we've discussed delivery of sets and packaging those is it does not lend itself very well to being transmitted directly over SMS. So some interesting questions that are going to come up over what that would look like.
Yeah,
so,
agree.
Perhaps a great topic for another delivery method spec.
Oh, God.
Would there be another spec for SMS delivery of set?
If people would, if that's a use case, I would assume so.
Well,
but there will be for SMS.
You are presenting the use case.
No,
so
I'm saying Annabelle was talking about mobile push, and
my question about mobile push was just to clarify whether the slide was correct in referring to SMS.
Yes.
Since you said it is, then
yes, then we would, correct.
Okay.
I thought Dick was on the mobile push
Yeah, I think as long as if
Yes.
Skim has the use case for events via SMS, then
Yep.
I think there potentially would be value in defining that
Delivery.
outside of the Skim specific context.
Yes, agree. Yes. Okay, thank you.
I'd like to thank both groups of authors. However, right now, these two use case documents are not in charter for the working group, and we do not expect them to become working group documents unless there's massive demand for that. With any other business?
Yeah. So that's the end of our formal agenda. We're at the any other business, if there's anything else.
No other business.
No other business? Okay. We're done.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, and
Thank you.
see you in Singapore.
Everyone signed the blue sheet that's here? It's right here. You'll have to finish. Yeah. So, you think that someone needs to implement both poll and post?